I'm Michael V, and this is Arcade Guts. Influential games of the early 90s, Street Fighter II not only revolutionized the fighting industry, but also played a part in the destruction of the arcade market. Now, many people love to brag about how Street Fighter II saved the arcades, but this is just not so. For within 1 year of its inception, Street Fighter II began to port itself to the home consoles of the day. While this was a common practice by now, what made Street Fighter different was the fact that the home ports of the game played and felt almost exactly as well as their arcade counterparts. Well, this was great news for both Capcom and the console wars. It was terrible news for arcade goers, for this was the first big step towards the death of the arcades.
Hey, why wait? Get the Super Nintendo version of Street Fighter II Turbo and bring the arcade action home. Like Balrog instead of the crowds. And actually, the Super NES version is better than the arcade version, no lie.
Proving that home systems could indeed crank out copies of arcade games that rivaled the originals, we would find more and more people staying at home to play the console ports of these titles. As a result, arcades would experience a drastic drop in profits, eventually leading to the crash of the arcade market.
While the console wars were the biggest culprit for the death of the arcades, Street Fighter II was their first big weapon. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at the game that saved the arcades, and in doing so, destroyed them.
In 1991, Capcom released its sequel to the poorly received Street Fighter. Street Fighter II was an instant classic with its in-depth gameplay, goofy visuals, and flashy special moves. Street Fighter II boasts some of the tightest controls in the history of video games. So tight, in fact, that Street Fighter II is still looked at today as the prototype for which all fighters thereafter would be based. While Street Fighter II was not the first game to have this kind of gameplay, it was the first to get it right. However, this game was not without its flaws. Since the game was such a huge success, most people who did not favor the game would keep their mouths shut, for if they ever uttered a grievance against the now revered Street Fighter II, they would receive an earful from any gamer nearby. However, I am a game reviewer, and my job is to tell you what I think, so let's get to it. Improving on the first Street Fighter II comes forth with a roster of 8 characters, all of which were vastly different in appearance and gameplay, except 2. In the original Street Fighter, you could play as Ryu or Ken. The only difference between these 2 characters was whether you were playing on the first or second player controls. However, when these characters moved on to Street Fighter II, they retained all their moves from the original title. As a result, we have 2 characters that play exactly the same. It does not matter how much story you put behind it. Gamers should not accept duplicate characters in their games.
I don't know who to pick. Ken or Ryu? They're the same freaking person!
Now, I'm not a big fan of downloadable content in modern games. The reason for this is, I believe a game should be released when it is finished. With the age of the internet, developers are allowed to release games that have major flaws, and you have to pay to get them fixed. Essentially, you are paying for a half-finished game. See, in the days of the Super Nintendo, a game was played as is, right out of the box. If there were any flaws in the game, then it would not be bought. Therefore, all the games had to be perfect, except Street Fighter II.
There are so many revisions and remakes of this game that it's hard to keep track of what made each revision different. Let's see, there was Street Fighter II, the original game. Then there was Street Fighter II Champion Edition, which was a faster version of the original with more characters added. Then there was Street Fighter II Hyper Fighting, which was the same damn game, just faster. Then came along Super Street Fighter II, the new challenger, which was the same game, adding even more characters. And finally, there was Super Street Fighter II Turbo, which was Super Street Fighter II with added super combos. Do you see where I'm going with this? They have been doing this for nearly 20 years, and with the release of Super Street Fighter II HD in the year 2008, we see Capcom has no plans on stopping.
Don't you guys see? Capcom has been repackaging the same game over and over for nearly 20 years, and all you Street Fighter fans keep eating it up. The only way we will ever get new Street Fighter games is when you guys stop buying the same game 100 times over. However, this is not a review of the various revisions of Street Fighter 2. This is a review of the original Street Fighter 2. So, let's move on.
While the controls for this game are spot on, there are certain aspects of the fighting engine that generally piss me off. In Street Fighter 2, if your opponent is kicking your butt too badly, your character gets dizzy, giving your opponent a free hit. Now, I am a big fan of getting free hits in games. However, the way Street Fighter does it is really agitating. See, I think a free hit should be able to turn the tide of the game. The way it should work is, you're losing badly, and you do some special move, and wham! You have a chance. That makes for dynamic gameplay. However, the way Street Fighter 2 does it just makes the winner keep on winning, which is unfair to the unfortunate fellow who probably just got caught in some never-ending combination of moves. Now, as a result of Street Fighter 2's success, nearly every developer tried to make a fighting game of their own, some of which were very original, while others were blatant copies of the game. As a result, many fighting games took the Street Fighter 2 formula and made vast improvements on it. So by today's standard, Street Fighter 2 is a slow-paced fighter with dull visuals. Now, many people refuse to admit this because they are so loyal to the franchise.
This is the best. I played every chance I get.
We see this happen a lot in culture. People love to say that Elvis Presley, for instance, was the best rock and roll singer. However, he was not the best. He was the first to make it big. Therefore, he's the king. We see this with Street Fighter 2 as well. It's not the best fighting game around. It was just the first to hit it big. Therefore, people like to say it's the best.
So, before I get to the final review, just let me make this desperate plea. If Street Fighter 4 rocks, then buy it. But if they have the nerve to release a game like Super Street Fighter 4 Turbo Hyper Fighting, don't buy it and demand Street Fighter 5. So, while Street Fighter 2 was a huge game back in its day and has influenced the fighting genre beyond belief, by today's standards, it is a pretty average, slow-paced fighting game that I'm going to give an average score of 3 out of 5. So until next time, I'm Michael B, and this has been Arcade Guts.